We're live. So,
I'm
good
just
evening.
terribly old-fashioned.
I'm Tom Putnam, the Edward W. Kane Executive Director here at the Concord Museum, and I thank all of you who have joined us for this virtual conversation with Washington Post syndicated columnist E.J. Dionne, Harvard Law professor Randall Kennedy, Boston Globe columnist and former editor of the Globe's editorial page Renee Loth, and human rights and civil liberties advocate and professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, John Shapp. We have lots of ground to cover, so I've asked our panelists to be as succinct as possible and thought I should model the same. So I'll briefly introduce each panelist as I ask them their first question. My favorite of E.J. Dionne's many quips is the story he tells of meeting this Commonwealth's then Republican Governor Bill Weld and surprising him by stating, "I'm a one-issue voter and you are on the right side of that issue." When the governor quizzically asked what issue that might be, E.J. replied, "Appointing my mother, Lucienne, to the governing board of Bristol Community College in my hometown of Fall River." And I'll note proudly that my wife was a professor of psychology at BCC for much of her college teaching career. So EJ and I are bound in our devotion to both Bristol Community College and the wonderful students and communities it serves. In addition, for writing for the Post, EJ is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a frequent commentator on NPR, PBS, and MSNBC, and the co-author of a new book, 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting. And I thought there's no better way to open this forum on the rights and responsibilities of citizenship and the future of our democracy than to ask EJ in just a few brief minutes to make that case to us all now. EJ.
Well, thank you so much. And I love that you remembered that story. And I explained my mom was 79 when he reappointed her to that board. And he immediately said, "Oh, I would have been killed down there if I hadn't reappointed your mother." And I thought two things. Well, that's probably right. I think he would be killed down there, would have been killed down there. But I also thought that if he made it up on the spot, he really was a good politician. So it worked either way. For me, and I'm so honored to be here with people I truly admire. Everyone on this panel, Renee and John and Randall Kennedy, are people I've read and profited from all my life. So thanks for being here. 100% Democracy, the book I wrote with my colleague and partner on this project, Miles Rappaport, argues that the best way to defend voting as a right is to assert a universal legal and civic duty to vote. That the making voting a duty will require government to take all the steps possible to help people do their duty, the way, in principle, we try to do with jury duty, which is another duty required of citizens by law. I like to say that the way we do elections now, we treat them like a fancy dinner party, where we have an A list of likely voters, a B list of voters who are registered but don't vote much, and a C list of citizens who aren't registered to vote at all. And they are treated completely differently. A-list voters get all the attention from politicians on their side to recruit them to vote, to push them to vote, but also are often encouraged not to vote if they are going to vote for the opposition. Their votes are suppressed and they get a lot of negative information. See the 2016 campaign. B-listers and C-listers are hardly ever asked at all. And it's a fact of life that when you are asked to do something, when you are invited to do something, you are more likely to do it. There's a Tip O'Neill story that may be apocryphal, but it was the story is Tip meeting a woman who's an old friend, and she congratulated him on his reelection. And he said, "I assume you voted for me." And she said, "Oh, no, I didn't." And he said, "Why?" And she replied, "You didn't ask me." And there are a whole lot of voters we neither ask nor invite to participate. The universal voting system, and I can explain it in more detail later how it will work, but as it works, for example, in Australia and has for 100 years, invites everyone in and says everyone has a role to play in our democracy. Using this system and making it easier for people to register and easier for people to vote, Australia registers 96% of its citizens, 90% of them participate. I'll just close. I don't know how many fans out there are of Harry Bosch. Michael Connelly, the great thriller writer's detective. But Bosch always says his approach to life is everybody counts or nobody counts. I think that's a good way to think about democracy.
Great. Thank you, EJ. Randall Kennedy is the Michael R. Klein Professor at Harvard Law School, a former law clerk for Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, the author of numerous books, including Say It Loud on Race, Law, History, and Culture, which I recommend to you, as well as an hour-long conversation he and I had about the book earlier this year, the link to which can be found on the Concord Museum's website, should you wish to watch it. My favorite line from that book, which gets to the heart of the question of voting rights, is Professor Kennedy's critique of Clarence Thomas's vote in the Shelby County v. Holder case, the Supreme Court decision that lifted the protections of the Voting Rights Act in 9 states with histories of racial discrimination. Professor Kennedy writes, quote, "If Clarence Thomas is not a sellout, then the term has no utility." So Randy, please remind the audience of what was at stake in the Shelby County v. Holder case, what has happened since that time that gravely concerns you about voting rights, and then we'll all be interested in your reaction to EJ's proposal concerning universal voting and whether it could play a role in addressing some of the crises and elections that our nation is facing today.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for this forum. Shelby County versus Holder was a case in which the Supreme Court of the United States invalidated a very important part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Supreme Court invalidated the part of the act that put special requirements onto states that had histories of voter disfranchisement. And the Supreme Court has lifted those special requirements. Now, what's bad about that? What's bad about that is as soon as those special requirements were lifted, there were efforts in those states to make voting more difficult. So in my view, there are all sorts of reasons why this is, as far as I'm concerned, an outrageous case. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 had been probably the most effective civil rights legislation of that era. There was still evidence of racial disfranchisement. The Congress of the United States had repeatedly authorized and reauthorized this legislation. And the Supreme Court of the United States, mainly with a theory concocted by the Chief Justice Roberts, just had a different policy conclusion and substituted its own views for those of Congress. Now, I think that Shelby County was an outrageous case, but actually our situation is even worse. It's not simply Shelby County, because after all, that case involved states that were mainly in the Deep South. Some of the problems that confront us now do not come from states in the Deep South. They come from states everywhere. They come from Ohio. They come from Wisconsin. States all over the country are attempting, usually with obvious invidious intent, to make voting more difficult. Now, as for EJ's suggestion about mandatory voting, I feel conflicted. On the one hand, I very much appreciate his call to civic duty, his effort to want to make our democracy more vivid, to bring people in, to have more debate, to have people be more active in the governing of the country. I think that I like that impulse. On the other hand, and here's the on the other hand, I fear that, especially at this moment, the idea of government mandating hardly anything generates a tremendous backlash. I mean, wear a mask so there'll be less likelihood of infecting your neighbor. Well, that has driven, millions of people around the bend. The idea of mandating voting, I think, at this moment would actually deepen and intensify the tremendous polarization that is putting our country at risk. I also have another difficulty, and that has to do with the impulse behind EJ's suggestion is an impulse in which he wants to draw in everyone. In fact, he said that he wants everybody to be involved. I'm not so sure. I mean, frankly, there are tens of millions of Americans who have voted, who have shown me that they really don't care very much about democracy. Their vote showed me that. Mm. And I am actually worried. I don't think that we can simply say the more people who vote, the better the state of our democracy. I want to know, what are they voting for? I want to know what are the policies that they're seeking to advance. I can easily imagine a society in which you have a lot of people voting, maybe 100%. And the upshot being terrible policies. I don't want that. So I'm not as sanguine about the universal vote as EJ is.
Okay. I mean, this is going to be hard because it'd be nice to hear from you, EJ, but we have two other people first. So
I'll come back.
As I mentioned, Renee Loth is an opinion columnist and for the Boston Globe, and when previously serving for 9 years as the editor of the Globe's editorial page, she was the highest ranking woman at the newspaper. And just as I am encouraging everyone to read various books written by our co-panelists, let me take this opportunity to thank the Boston Globe and its editor, Brian McGrory, for co-sponsoring tonight's event, and encourage you to support either the Globe or whatever source your source is for independent journalism. Renee is currently a lecturer in public policy and opinion writing at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. I always stop to read her columns when they run in the Globe, including one about EJ's universal voting proposal that was written in 2020. So her homework, at least for this portion of our conversation, was completed over 2 years ago. So welcome, Renee, and have at it.
Thank you, Tom, and welcome everybody. Let me just start by saying that I'm really glad we've begun this conversation with a question about voting rights, because this undergirds every other issue, right? Every one of the plagues that we're experiencing in this country now, whether it's the pandemic, of course, but also gun violence and racism and other forms of hatred and the climate crisis and, people like adopting Looney Tune conspiracy theories about our government. These are all issues that require the informed participation of the public to be set right. And we can't do that while if the mechanics of our very democracy are not functioning. And I think they're not functioning right now. We're probably going to hear from John later that Americans, the sort of mass of Americans, agree on more issues than we might think, watching the media or listening to politicians. But if they're not voting, then it's like, the tree that falls in the forest. It doesn't really have that much impact. So, as to EJ's and Miles's proposal, my position is pretty much the same as it was 2 years ago. I'm a skeptic because for many of the same reasons that Randy mentioned. I fear that it could inflame the anti-government fervor that is so dangerous and that's so abroad in the land right now. But I'm intrigued by it, particularly on one aspect, which is that I think that broadening the pool of voters would have the effect of diluting the extremes. If everybody's voting, then the candidates can't just pander to their bases on either side, which, people who tend to vote, especially in primaries, are the more, polarized voters. And so if you were to expand the voting pool, then maybe there would be less of that appeal to the extremes, which I think would be a big help. I'd like to see that, especially in the primaries.
Great. Baseball managers often have their favorite players hit in the cleanup position. I won't hide the fact that John Shattuck is a good friend, a former colleague, and full disclosure, served on the search committee when I got the biggest break of my career and was asked to serve as the 5th director of the Kennedy Library. In fact, I still have the replica bowl, Paul Revere bowl, John, that you gave as a farewell gift when you stepped down as head of the Kennedy Library Foundation to become president and rector of Central European University.
Tom, I can't resist saying I wish all Supreme Court justices were as forthcoming with disclosures as you are. That's a wonderful thing.
And the reference to the Paul Revere Bowl, allow me a shameless plug to remind everyone that if you have not been to the Concord Museum, we have one of the 2 lanterns hung in the Old North Church at Paul Revere's direction to signal that the British regulars were coming by sea and not land, and the other lantern is lost to history. Anyway, previous to the positions I mentioned, John served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor under President Clinton, and our ambassador to the Czech Republic. In addition to teaching at the Fletcher School, he is a senior fellow at Harvard's Carr Center for Human Rights, and he is the co-author of a new book, Holding Together: The Hijacking of Rights in America and How to Reclaim Them for Everyone. We'll hear more about the book later in the program, but for the moment, John, can you share your thoughts about EJ's universal voting proposal?
Thanks, Tom, and it's wonderful to be here with you. I have behind me a voting rights march extending all the way back to the 1960s. So voting rights is at the core of my own interests. And certainly, as Renee said, it's at the core of the whole system of rights of democracy that we have in the country today. It's under assault. Voting rights are totally under assault. I think probably no more so than what we're seeing unveiled right now in the January 6th committee, which is the effort by a minority a minority of political minority to essentially undermine the votes of millions of Americans by falsely alleging that there was voter fraud in the 2020 presidential election, and thereby to overturn the results of that election. So, I think there's no question that what EJ has done here is a big service. Thank you, EJ. You're really pushing voting rights and the responsibility that citizens have to vote to make the democracy work into the forefront. And I'm totally in favor of doing everything possible to sweep away the various impediments there are to voting, many of which are now being imposed by those who would like to restrict voting because they don't like the way some of the votes are going. They're not going in their direction. We had 35 new state laws in 19 states over the last year that have restricted the right to vote. So again, all of the efforts to make voting a universal civic duty are a good idea. I have one small beef, which is hardly surprising. It's a civil liberties beef, and it's the same one that you've heard already from Randy and to some extent from Renee, which is that, there is a concern about turning what is a constitutional right into a mandate, in other words, requiring that people actually exercise that constitutional right. And it's sort of oxymoronic. You can't require someone to do something that they have a right not to do as well as to do. So that's an issue of constitutional principle. But there's also a very practical issue here. And here again, I think Randy has raised this. The problem is that we're living in a highly polarized world now, and almost any mandates that come from the government are likely to be seen as imposing unfair or restrictive requirements on people that they don't agree with. So whether or not one wants to mandate, I think the impact of a mandate, including some penalties, we haven't heard from EJ yet about the penalties that are associated with not voting under his scheme, that I think raises the possibility that the whole thing might be attacked as a huge government imposition on what should be personal decision and a constitutional right that is either exercised or people choose not to. So I agree with 99% of what has been proposed here, but the 1% that I disagree with is the mandate.
We're going to go on to some other issues, but EJ, you have a chance to kind of rebut all of the points that you've just heard.
Yeah, no, never have I had critiques from people I like or respect more. And by the way, Professor Kennedy is so right about the Voting Rights Act. It was weakened further by Justice Alito, as he knows. And we are now 2 countries when it comes to voting. Since 2020, 25 states have made it easier still to vote, and 19 states have made it harder. This is really problematic. So I want to answer these concisely, if I can, but it was a barrage of criticism, friendly criticism, warm criticism, but I want to deal with it. Let me deal with John's first, which is the question of do mandates undercut rights? And here I repair again to jury duty. One of the greatest victories of the civil rights movement was to end discrimination in the selection of juries. What that meant is that we told Black people that they too must be part of the group of citizens who are compelled to serve on juries. We have compulsory jury service because we want a jury that is in a pool, in principle, that's representative of the whole. Now, I know there are all kinds of problems with challenges at juries, and I know there are imperfections at the system, but the idea of the mandate is to make sure that everybody is involved in principle in the decision-making. That's why we link this to voting. A second, on where the public is, we did polling on this idea back in February of 2020, before Donald Trump did all of his election craziness. So I admit that the numbers might be a little different now. First, Miles and I are either 2 of the most honest or 2 of the dumbest book writers in history, because our polling shows that right now only 26% of Americans support our idea. The way I read the poll positively, 48% strongly oppose it, which leaves about half the public open, at least to persuasion on the idea. What we found is there was almost no party split, that Democrats are only a few points more likely than Republicans to support this. Independents actually didn't like it as much. And if we asked a separate question, do you see voting as a right or a duty, or neither, 61% of Americans agree that it is both a right and a duty. Our system is designed to be a nudge, not a shove or a hammer. And it's modeled after the Australian system. In Australia, first of all, the government makes it very easy for you to register. If you register and don't vote, you get a notice from the government. If you offer any kind of reasonable excuse for not voting, you don't pay a fine. If you pay the fine, it's $20 Australian, $15 American right now, last I checked. And only 13% of people end up paying the penalty. So that's really light touch enforcement. We would also, under our system, we don't want a Ferguson problem. There's a $20 fine. It can't be multiplied. It's not criminal, it's civil, so you can't get into any of that kind of trouble. You could pay it by doing an hour of community service. There's a reason beyond the PR of it that we don't call it compulsory voting, because under the Australian system and our system, you are not compelled to choose a candidate. You can cast a blank ballot, you can write in Professor Kennedy, you can scrawl an obscenity across it if you want. You can do anything you want with your ballot. And we believe that both for constitutional reasons and for moral reasons, you can't force people to make a choice if they don't want to make it. And just to make that clear, we would add a none of the above choice on the ballot. A lot of people say, well, you take away my right to protest by not voting. Well, not voting is not a very effective protest, because a lot of people don't vote for a million other reasons than protesting. And under our system, if you wanted to protest, you could check that none of the above box. You could check that, cast that blank ballot, which would be counted, which we think is a more effective form of protest than abstention. Lastly, on Professor Kennedy's point about who is brought into this, the electorate, by this. On the one hand, I do believe in 100% democracy, and I like our idea what our idea could do, which is instead of arguing at the edges about whether you favor this voter restriction or that one, or do you want to expand it, early voting, we want to know, are you for 100% democracy or not? And if you're trying to keep people out, who are you trying to keep out of the electorate and why? So we want to call the question with this idea. But the people you would bring in our country, young people vote way less than others because the system makes it much harder on young people to vote because they move around more. Our system would make it much easier. We, among other things, we want election day registration as part of the gateway reforms that would make this work. More low-income people would vote. They are excluded. Black turnout is almost equal to white turnout right now, but it's still a little lower. Latino and Asian turnout is lower. But here's the other thing, and this goes to Renee's point on polarization. You would bring into the electorate people who are less ideological. And that's certainly what's happened in Australia. A friend of mine who was interviewed for the book, the former leader of the Labour Party, Kim Beazley, said, you know, the non-ideological voters brought into the system by this would just not go for those QAnon nuts because they are not highly ideological. And as for voter knowledge, again, Kim stood outside of polling places from the time he was a kid. His dad was a politician. And he made the point that, sure, there are election junkies who know all sorts of things, although he said being better informed is never a guarantee of having better judgment, which we know. But that he said the voters who are required to vote engage in the system because they know they have to. And that when you talk to them, they have reasons for voting that are sensible, and they know that they are expected to do their civic duty and they take it seriously. So I think that this does have the effect of increasing the level of civic knowledge because people end up taking this obligation very seriously. By the way, they have great food at polling places in Australia, which I'd be happy to talk about more.
So again, the book is 100% Democracy, the Case for Universal Voting. I recommend it, but I'm going to move us to another right. I mean, there are a number of rights under assault at the moment. So we all know a decision is looming on the Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization case that concerns a Mississippi law that bans all abortions past 15 weeks, except in very limited medical circumstances. And I thought we'd turn briefly now to a conversation about the right to privacy, which is undergirding the Roe v. Wade decision. And Renee, you've written on this topic, and why don't you start us off?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, let me first say that privacy, the right to privacy, is a multi-pronged issue. You know, as a journalist, I have seen privacy claims used to prevent the distribution of information that's actually in the public interest. You know, so I'm not a privacy absolutist. I can see times when privacy has been used, you know, for bad purposes. But in the case of a woman's bodily autonomy, I think that the principle of privacy is clearly here. And I very much worry about what's coming down the pike with the looming decision. I think it's not a coincidence, and we can link together these first two topics. It's not a coincidence that the very same women who will be most affected by eliminating abortion rights, younger women, poorer women, women of color, women without resources, are the same people who will be affected by limiting voting rights. So you know, there's something going on here that's greater than the sum of its parts. I also think, and you know, in my opinion, and I'm not a lawyer, thank God, but I also think that in the case of abortion rights, that not just the right to privacy is implicated, but also the freedom of religion rights that are in the First Amendment. You know, there's a congregation now, a Jewish congregation in Florida, which is suing the state over its latest abortion ban law, claiming that Jewish law at times requires abortion when it would save the life or the mental and physical well-being of the woman. And so in this argument, the this Florida law violates their freedom of religion. So, there's an irony here because this court has been so upfront about, protecting or championing religious freedom rights. I mean, just this week, right? There was a case in the state of Maine that allowed the religious schools to access public funds. So I mean, you can call it an irony. I might call it a hypocrisy. But it'll be interesting to see how this court squares that circle. I just think that it's, we talked again, how I would connect the two topics. We talked about how there are 25 states that have increased the right to vote and the access to voting and, making it easier with mail-in voting and making permanent the sort of pandemic era easing of voting. And some states that are making it much harder. Similarly, if Roe is gone, there'll be 50 states with 50 different rules, 50 different laws. And, we're going to be seeing more division and more polarization, between states that support these rights and states that don't.
Thanks. Randy, why don't we go to you next about the right to privacy?
Well, with respect to the issue of abortion, people talk about obviously the right to privacy. Renee just talked about religion. For me, the way I see this is I see this as an attack on the status, the place of women. So for me, frankly, equal protection resonates most with me. I see this as a real attack on the place of women in our society. Renee said, no accident. It's no accident where this is coming from. It's no accident that this case is coming from Mississippi. When Mississippi, well, we were just talking about voting.
Right.
We've been talking about various various ways in which various groups in American life have been put down. What we're talking about here is the putting down of women. Now, of course, women of means, women of, and when I say means, sometimes I mean, money, affluence, but, knowledge, people who know how to get around, they'll be able to get around. It's going to be the most vulnerable who are going to be hurt, who are being hurt. Last thing I'll say is, we're waiting for this decision to come down. With every indication is that Roe versus Wade will be overturned. I don't think we should, overlook the fact that as things currently stand, there are lots of places in America where it is already extremely difficult for women to avail themselves of abortion and other needed medical treatments having to do with reproductive rights. So I view this as this is one of the things that makes me feel very frankly disheartened. I feel tremendous trepidation about the state of our culture, the state of our society, and the attack on abortion rights is one of the central reasons why I feel such trepidation.
John, you talk about it in your book, and you have some polling data. What are your thoughts that you want to share on this issue?
Well, let me start with the polling data, which is completely out of line with where it would appear the Supreme Court is going. Polling data that we assembled for the book, and there's a lot of it, I'll go over a little bit in a minute, includes a really striking figure of 72% of Americans, including 52% of Republicans, agree, and I quote, that a woman's right to make decisions affecting her body and her personal life should be protected. So, this is really what's going on here is an example of something I'm going to be talking about in a minute, which is essentially a political minority is in the process of hijacking not only our rights, but our democracy. And I agree certainly with Randy that this is a direct and immediate attack on women, particularly women without means and women of color and of a whole variety of people who are unable to access, information and medical procedures relating to abortion in states where they might get it. What we have here, I think, is a terrible double bind for women. On the one hand, the right to personal autonomy, which is sort of at the core of the Roe decision, is going to be denied. But the right to personal autonomy isn't really possible to exercise without a right to non-discrimination, a right to equal protection. And that too is going to be overturned in this decision. There's an incredible part of the draft opinion of Justice Alito, which one hopes is going to be significantly changed, but that doesn't mean the result's going to be a change, which I think dramatizes what I'm saying about the attack on women, where essentially women are dismissed in this draft in the following particular, and I'm going to read it, the particular clause of the draft decision. The regulation of a medical procedure that only one sex can undergo does not trigger heightened constitutional scrutiny unless the regulation is a mere pretext designed to effect an invidious discrimination. The goal of preventing abortion does not constitute invidious discrimination. Accordingly, laws regulating or prohibiting abortion are governed by the same standard of review as other health and safety measures. In other words, women are protected in the same, as if they were built, as if buildings or food safety or other issues that are out there in the public that aren't subject to the kind of very special scrutiny when it has to do with discrimination against people. And in this case, particularly women. So we have, I think, a very, very dangerous counter-majoritarian in that sense. Not that right should always reflect the majority, but in this case, the majority wants this right to be protected. And we also have the potential disintegration of the federal system of rights insofar as it relates to abortion. And it gets overtaken by a kind of state-by-state balkanized view, which is the sort of thing that Randy was talking about and Renee as well. So it's a very dangerous moment.
EJ. EJ, you're muted. You're muted.
I always say the one good thing about the pandemic for me is it's the only time in my life people said unmute yourself. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you for that. I can't resist noting that a pro-life Supreme Court today ruled that it should be easier for people to get guns, which they can presumably kill each other with. And I just think it's a remarkable disjunction, what they did on guns and what they say they think about abortion. And let me also say, I have a lot of sympathy for the pro-life side. I get moral objection, why people have a moral objection to abortion. It is a very complicated moral issue. I know a lot of pro-choice women who would not themselves have abortions. So I get that. The problem with making abortion illegal like this is, as Randy said right at the start, it will not stop abortion. It will simply make abortion illegal and make it less accessible to some people than others. And so it's a kind of double discrimination. I agree with John. My least favorite passage, I think, in that Alito opinion is the one he read. Just because only women are affected by this doesn't mean it has anything to do with gender. It's a kind of odd sort of argument. I think he made it because he knew exactly what the problem was, and he didn't solve it with that paragraph, I think. But making abortion illegal would, among other things, create more deaths among women who would get illegal abortion. So I personally would like a much better dialogue on this issue than we're having now. What really troubles me about the reasoning in this opinion goes back to where we started in the conversation, not on universal voting, but on democracy itself. Because the implication here is that if you just throw this back into state legislatures, this solves the problem. Well, a couple of things about democracy. First, none of these justices, when they went through the democratic small d process of confirmation, none of them were willing to say outright, I will overturn Roe v. Wade. So there was no democratic accountability for what they clearly intended to do. Susan Collins says that Justice Kavanaugh indicated to her that he wouldn't overturn Roe v. Wade. And we don't want to get off into Senator Collins's politics or anything here, but it was really an avoidance game that they played. Where was the democracy in that? If they had said what they thought and what they intended to do, some senators might have voted differently. And when you look at how this court was created, this particular majority got created in an anti-democratic way, with Merrick Garland being kept off, with Amy Coney Barrett being rushed in days before the last election. That raises a lot of problems for democracy too. And so I think that if the Alito opinion if the final opinion is anything like Alito's, it will be an explosion in American politics. And I think it will create the backlash against the court that I think should have been created already by decisions on voting rights, environmental regulation, labor rights. This is a court shoving us back into the late 19th century. And that should have been obvious before this. If it wasn't, it will be obvious the day after Roe is overturned.
Before I turn to the last round of questions, we're running out of time, but Renee, you started this one. You want to react to anything your colleagues said?
Well, I completely agree with my colleagues here, but I would just say that we should not believe that this is the end, and that the courts or the forces against of progress for women in particular, but in citizens in general, won't stop at abortion rights. There are there's contraceptive rights, there's gay marriage, there's a whole raft of other issues that similarly split this country, and that the justices sitting on the bench now could overturn, because they've shown that they have no respect for precedent.
By the way, Tom, there's one other thing I want to say. I'll be very quick.
Sure.
If you want to reduce abortion, the best way to reduce abortion is to help poor mothers who bring their children into the world and give them the support that they need. That abortion is concentrated heavily at the lower end of the income scale. So if you want to reduce abortion, let's help mothers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to turn to our last round, and I promised John that I give another plug for your book, which I really enjoyed reading, and allow you to explain why you remain hopeful that protecting the rights of all Americans can bring us together as a nation instead of tearing us apart. So, John Shattuck.
Well, I think this is a moment where we need to kind of shift gears a little bit and try to take stock of what the assets that we have in America are related to the basic principles and values of democracy and democratic rights and responsibilities. And what we did in our book is to take a look at the attitudes that Americans have toward their rights today. We conducted a series of national polls and town hall meetings through the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, and we collected some remarkable data that I think frankly surprised us. What we found, and the most striking fact, is that 80% of people across the political spectrum said that, quote, without our rights, America is nothing. So we do have values that we hold on to as Americans. We differ about those values. There are many different meanings. We know that there's a conflict between the right not to wear a mask and the right to be protected from COVID and all these kinds of things. But despite these conflicts, our polls that we report in the book show that 80% of Americans believe that we have more in common than most people think. So that's an asset. I mean, it doesn't mean that it's going to solve our problems, but it means that we need to take stock of who we are and understand. It's at odds with the division and extremism that we see all around us. The majority of Americans actually agree that rights must be balanced with responsibilities. The right to vote is also a responsibility to vote, as EJ in his book very eloquently points out. 8 out of 10 people agree that personal freedom should be balanced against a responsibility to keep people safe in a pandemic. So there are a whole variety of ways in which responsibilities emerge as a way to balance rights, including in the area of guns, for example, where 70% of Americans are in favor of reasonable safety regulation of guns. And that's why we're seeing, in the case of a new Senate bill, a possibility of some bipartisan agreement. So there's a lot going on here that's really counterintuitive to the polarization that we face in the country today. Again, this is at a very high level, to be sure, and it's at the level of general values rather than specific issues. But, you know, at the bottom line is that a great majority of Americans, about 75%, see rights and responsibilities of citizenship as core values of the nation, and they determine what it is to be an American. So this is what I call the new silent majority. This is really a majority that we need to call on and begin to figure out how to mobilize or engage. It has the potential to hold the country together, but its very diversity, political diversity in particular, keeps it from being politically cohesive. It disagrees about many issues, even though it agrees about values. But above all, and this is the second big point of the book, this silent majority is overshadowed by an extremist minority that's actively polarizing the country. This minority is made up of a mostly white constituency motivated by fear, an extremist constituency that denies that equal rights of others whom they regard as threats to their own racial and cultural and political identity. And to attack rights, they're spreading disinformation and manipulating democratic institutions. They're not just a formless mass. There are really 4 categories of these extremists. There are the leaders. We know who they are: political entrepreneurs who promote lies and fears to attack enemies and call the press the enemies of the people, and to call politicians they disagree with the enemies of the people. The second are the supporters who oppose equal rights for others as a threat to their own dominance, or at least their own rights. They see voting rights as a threat to their demographic dominance. They see racial equality as a threat to their racial dominance. They see abortion rights as a threat to their cultural dominance. And then the third group are the extremist media and the social media that spread disinformation and can stimulate violent attacks like the hundreds of mass shootings that we've seen this year, and above all, the Capitol insurrection, which we've talked about previously. And the fourth group are perhaps the most surprising, and we were just talking about them, because they are in the place where rights are generally enforced, the federal courts, and particularly the Supreme Court, where the majority was appointed, or those who make up the majority now, by a president who twice lost the popular vote. So it hardly reflects the input of the majority. And they're now beginning to dismantle rights that a majority of Americans want to see protected, such as the right of a woman to choose whether or not to bear a child. So the most visible example of this attack is in the right to vote. And we've talked about this, so I won't say anything further about it, except to say our poll shows overwhelmingly that Americans want to strengthen, not weaken, the right to vote. 87%, including 80% of Republicans, favor national standards to protect the electoral process. So again and again, we see a disconnect between the polling, the underlying values that Americans feel they continue to have, and the activities that are now going on in a highly polarized political arena. So the key question is whether the silent majority, as I've described it, can make its voice heard and begin to push back against the extremist minority. And I think there are several recent positive signs. The bipartisan gun safety bill, notwithstanding the terrible decision that was handed down today by the Supreme Court on expanding essentially the right to bear arms. And I think the various election officials and Justice Department officials who very visibly are seen to have rejected the lies about the election fraud that led to the Capitol insurrection. All of that is a positive sign about the silent majority perhaps beginning to be heard, but we have a long way to go. So I'll stop at that. That's really the gist of the book. And I'm sure others will be able to comment about this whole topic.
Great, thank you. John, surprising that two Kennedy acolytes would have organized a forum promoting Richard Nixon's silent majority, but
yes,
reference to it, but there you have it. Randy, you have a number of essays in your book in which you discuss why you remain a racial optimist despite having grave concerns about recent developments in our politics. So I thought as a final question to you, if you could comment briefly on that, and perhaps in the areas that concern you, if you have a suggestion or two for our viewers about where they could make a difference, or, again, why your overall views about being a racial optimist, concerns you have, and what you think people should do.
Well, thank you for the question. I want to pick up on John's excellent comment. I think it's important to be realistic about our situation. And part of being realistic is to do what John just did, which was to take into account our assets. So, if we're talking about race, and again, remember, I feel I feel pretty downhearted at this moment. But to take a leaf from what John's comments, the Vice President of the United States of America is a Black woman. The head of the Department of Defense is a Black man. In our recent history, for 8 years, the President of the United States was a Black American. Now, these are things which, in my lifetime, when I was very young, would I have foreseen this? No. So there are assets. It's not as if there's not a struggle going on. There is a struggle going on. And I think that being realistic means paying attention to the resources that are available to people who want to lift American society to a higher level. We have to be attentive to that. And that's very important. Having said that, I remain very, very concerned. I have never felt more trepidation about the future of the United States than I feel right now, than I have felt in the past 5 years. I remember 1968 vividly. Martin Luther King is killed, Robert Kennedy is killed, there is rioting in the streets. I grew up in Washington, D.C. I remember soldiers telling me that I had to leave the tennis court and go home because there was a curfew. But 1968, as much as the Chicago, the police riot in the summer of 1968, in 1968, people were not fearing the unraveling of democracy like they are fearing it now. The whole idea of a peaceful transfer of power, that was not an issue in 1968. It was an issue in our last election. It will be an issue probably in our next one. So these are some of the reasons why I feel tremendous sadness, tremendous anxiety. That's why I feel chastened But having said that, I really want to embrace the spirit and the information that John brought to our attention. Thank you.
Great. EJ, same closing question to you. What makes you hopeful? What concerns you? What viewers can do? Where you'd like to see them get involved?
Well, first, I agree utterly with Professor Kennedy. I've said the same thing and been thinking the same thing. I remember that period 68 to 72 vividly, and I feel much more worried about our country and our democracy than I did then. I suppose it's something connected with Kennedy, so I could say that, to compare Donald Trump to Richard Nixon is unfair to Richard Nixon in the end, when you think of the impact that he had on our democracy. And no leader in our history has done what Trump did to our democracy. And we are, in a sense, in a backlash against racial inclusion that is very similar to the backlash that ended Reconstruction in the South. And the question is, will we keep it from getting worse? We're not as bad off as we were when Reconstruction was utterly destroyed and a system of racial subjugation was reimposed. We're not there. But the backlash, the direction that we're being pushed back is the same. And that really alarms me. My disclosure is I have a blurb on John's book with his colleagues, and I love its hopefulness, and I love some of this polling data, although I think there is no more ironic polling question than I think we have more in common than most people do, because most people don't think we have much in common. So what's the real polling number? But anyway, it's an interesting riddle, that polling question. I am hopeful because opinion of younger Americans, say under 45, tends to be more open, more hopeful, more tolerant. And that I always tell our kids that if we can get through the next 10 years, we'll be fine. And when my generation dies off and theirs takes over, I think the country will be fine. And the only problem with my analysis is I want to be around to see it. So that's my contradiction in my analysis. And so I do have hope, a lot of hope in this next generation. But I think the next 10 years are going to be really hard. And I think the problem, last point, the problem with the kind of polarization we have is all our identities are now wrapped in one big ball. That if you are a Republican, you tend to be white, you tend to be Christian, you're disproportionately Southern. That if you are the Democratic coalition is much more diverse. It is less religious now than it used to be. And so all these groups are facing off, and the Republican Party in particular has radicalized in ways that I think give the more moderate Republicans very little opportunity to express themselves. And I hope that these hearings might give some people in the Republican Party listening to the testimony of Republicans to say, at the very least, we've had enough of this. I don't see that happening yet, but I think the evidence put on the table here ought to push some in that direction and at least give us a somewhat different kind of Republican Party, the kind I used to like when there were moderate and liberal Republicans in this nation.
Renee, final word to you, the same question I posed to others, and I hope as someone who's spent her career as a journalist, you might comment on the role of the media in all of this.
Yeah. Well, so ditto everything that everybody else has said, and ditto, I remember 1968. I personally, I want to stipulate things are bad. Things are really bad, and maybe worse than at any time I can recall, because the very fundamental mechanics of our democracy are under attack. But I will not, succumb to despair, because although it's tempting, because, that's like surrendering to the forces of the status quo, or the forces that are tearing our democracy apart. They want us to be despairing. They want us to be, demoralized and paralyzed and not able to, get up and get active. And we have to do that in order to save our democracy. I wanted to, just call out another asset we have that is really under attack, and that is local journalism. I mean, I think that You talk about the hearings, a lot of people on the other side are just not watching them because it's a national program and the national media is so polarized. But I think that local journalism is the civic glue that holds communities together. And we all know that newspapers are dying everywhere, especially the small local papers. They're the ones that when journalists are losing their jobs, and their jobs were to hold people accountable, local officials accountable, to sort of keep an eye on their local communities, to try to inform people and educate them so that they can be better citizens. And a lot of studies have been done recently that show that in the absence of local newspapers, people tend to go to social media, which is either often not reliable, to say the least, or to national media and national issues. And that just only increases polarization, because it's easier to sort of accept some Looney Tune theory about what's going on in our country when you're talking about some abstract, distant Washington, than it is when you're talking about an issue that's going on right in your own community that you can see with your own eyes. And so I just want to say that I think there are a couple of glimmers of hope in that regard, including right in Concord, Massachusetts, where there is an effort to try to start a local newspaper, often with the help of grizzled veterans like myself who are semi-retired or who have the time and energy to lead a new effort to have local journalism. And it's just these journalists are at the front lines of democracy. They're the ones doing the work that can be verified and that's independent. And I just want to say we should support them whenever possible.
Tom, could I jump in for 1 second? Because I so identify with everything Renee said, except one thing. There's nothing grizzled about you, Renee. But there were two, you've been kind to plug our books here. I want to plug two books on this, one by Margaret Sullivan called Ghosting the News, and another by Martha Minow called Saving the News. Because saving local journalism, it is really in trouble all across our country. The Globe is better off than a lot of other papers, and the Globe has gone through a lot of struggles. But we are in great trouble if we lose this civic glue, and I'm just so glad Renee mentioned it, and these two books really shed a lot of light on that.
Thank you.
I have a closing comment, but Randy or John.
Let me make one, this, as we talk about the media, and thank you, Renee and EJ, for very insightful comments about that particularly. But I also want to make sure that we don't leave out the new world of media. Unfortunately, that world is the world in many respects, the social media and the digital world, where the disinformation that is so much a major liability in our democracy today is being spread. And what might be done about that? I think this, again, we've done some polling data on this, and there's certainly some recommendations that have been made and things that are being explored. But I think above all, trying to understand better the algorithmic basis for some of the disinformation that is being spread, and having more transparency of the way in which decisions are made with respect to the use of algorithms in social media is one way to go. It's a very complicated field. Certainly, we don't want to touch anything that involves basic issues of freedom of speech, freedom of communication, but we need to begin to find mechanisms, regulatory and otherwise, to deal with disinformation. I've just come back from a short trip to Europe, and the European Union has done a very good job in this area with something called the Digital Services Act that they've just enacted, which does require algorithmic transparency. It's going to have a big impact on the social media giants that are originating here as they operate inside of Europe. Europe is also much better than we are at dealing with basic issues of data privacy. So these, there are possibilities out there. This goes to a little bit of glimmer of hopefulness, just as I think the bipartisan gun legislation, which involved compromises, which are at the heart of democracy, is another glimmer of hope. So again, specifically disinformation and social media, I think needs to be on the agenda.
Great. Randy, spoiler alert, I'm going to actually end with a quote of yours, but do you have a comment anything you want to respond to in this last exchange?
I very much appreciated this forum, and I would say that people talked about, local media. This is local media. And this sort of activity where people are exchanging ideas, commenting on one another's ideas, criticizing one another's ideas, this is the making of a better democracy. Thanks so much for letting me participate.
Sure.
Tom, I have one last comment, and it relates to you. Since you're going to quote Kennedy, I'm not going to quote you, but I'm going to salute you.
Mm-hmm.
You've done an extraordinary job running the Concord Museum, as I understand it. I'm not there, and I don't see it every day, but I've certainly picked up on the way in which you've managed to project democratic values and a public discourse in a very rare way, particularly during the time of this pandemic. So I know the audience that's tuned into this probably is well aware of what you're doing, but I just wanted to pay my own tribute to it. So congratulations. And I know at the end of this probably this month even, you're going to be stepping down. So I just want to salute you.
Thank you. So I have some closing words. Again, hearkening back to the Kennedy Library, I thought I'd start with a quote from our 35th president. "Democracy is never a final achievement. It is a call to an untiring effort." We hearken back tonight to those who heard that call on April 19th, 1775, and defended freedom's cause in the battles of Lexington and Concord, and to those towering figures of transcendentalism and the abolitionist period looking over my shoulder: Thoreau, Douglas, Alcott, Fuller, and of course, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who reminded us, "Freedom has nothing to do with having the right to vote for your oppressor. Freedom is not having any form of oppression at all." I want to especially thank our four panelists for giving us of their time and talent and imparting much wisdom to us this evening. And while it's a little awkward to quote someone who's here among us in rereading the books today, I thought I'd close with some words from Professor Kennedy's new book, which I should note in this version contain a few ellipses, but I hope capture the essence of his original phrasing. And actually, he echoes something you just said a moment ago, Renee. So these are Randy Kennedy's words. "I continue to decline to embrace despair. I evince hopefulness largely out of habit and a forlong yearning on behalf of my children. I continue to favor assessing competing visions of racial promised lands, but I'm also swept up by a chastened caution that has been significantly intensified by the misplaced certainties of the abolitionists. I've become much less enamored of the idea of a grand design. Maybe it is prudent to forswear strict allegiance to any grand blueprint that would seek to master our unruly racial reality. Maybe the best that can safely be managed are smaller, though significant interstitial goals that are attentive to the pluralism that infuses American practices, a yearning for racial promised lands alongside pragmatic acceptance of decent compromises." So I know I join with my fellow panelists in thanking all of you who were watching for spending this last hour or so with us. We hope the conversation will inspire you to respond to democracy's call as you best see fit, and as together we seek to inch forward to the promised land of a more perfect union, one pragmatic and decent compromise at a time. Thank you and good night.
Great.
Thank
Thank you. Good
Thank
job.
you.
Thank you all very much.